and we're going to cover it fairly thoroughly. I think there are whole classes that you can take where you can study the Revolutionary War in great detail, and this is not necessarily one of them. But we're going to cover it so that we understand some of the legacy of the Revolutionary War and why it affected American history the way that it did. Did y'all notice, by the way? Did anybody notice? Savannah, did you notice? No. The beeping noise is gone. What was that? It's the alarm. The alarm has literally been going off for months, and nobody could figure out how to shut it off.
Well, I knew that. I just didn't know if it was like a thing. It would go off like every 3 or 4 seconds. So
Yep. Okay. So I'm going to say something kind of about the Revolutionary War that's something that people don't always like to talk about, especially if you take your history classes in certain states. Texas is definitely one of them. About the American Revolution, and that is that America did not win the American Revolution. Here comes the FBI. Hi, Jordan. Okay. America did not win the American Revolution. And we're going to talk about why. We have all of the benefits of having the American Revolution behind us, but we didn't win it. So let's talk about why. At the beginning of the Revolution, the difference in these two militaries, the British military and the American military, is pretty stark. I mean, it's pretty ridiculous. The British have a higher population. There are 7.5 million people in the British islands, so England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland. There are only 2.5 million people in the colonies. So if you need to grow an army, if you need to recruit more people, Britain's going to have an easier time of recruiting more people than America is. Okay, so they have a larger military force already. British military has already been fighting conflicts with the French and with the Spanish and with the Dutch occasionally. So they've had a military, they've had a land infantry, and they've had a navy for quite some time. And they have access to all of their colonial resources plus their own kingdom for supplies. So for making weapons, for food, for all of those things, Britain actually has a better source of supply, while the American colonies have been basically growing the crops that Britain told them to. So they haven't been able to develop their own industries. On the other hand, Britain also has other things going on. Britain is also fighting with Ireland and France at the beginning of the Revolutionary War. Britain is already engaged in military actions with other countries. At the top, we have a prime minister, Lord North, who is not a very good prime minister, but he was appointed by King George III, who's crazy. So at the top of the pyramid of British leadership, you've got a king who doesn't know what he's doing and is kind of insane, King George III, and his prime minister, whom he appointed because he was a good friend and because he thought he was a good guy. We've seen recently what can happen when somebody becomes the person in the ear of the person in charge and isn't actually qualified to answer all of the questions they need to answer. We've seen that in a couple of countries recently. So bad leadership at the top. Every decision has to be made over a long distance. So if colonial troops move in a certain direction, then the military decisions have to be made through Parliament, which means a ship going back and forth. Remember, there's no telegraph, there's no long distance communication other than ship travel. So every decision has to be made over a long distance. If the British forces in the colonies need funding, they have to contact Parliament, and Parliament has to get back with them. That's a long distance decision that has to be made constantly. And there is this basic reluctance to kill Americans. You have to remember that to the English, the colonists are also English. So they are othered because they are, they live in the colonies and because they're in rebellion, but they speak the same language and they have a lot of the same background and they have a lot of the same mythology. They're from English. I mean, they're descended from the English. So amongst the rank and file of the English, there's a basic reluctance to kill Americans. They don't really want to kill people that are just like them in every way, except for the fact that they happen to live in the colonies. And one big British weakness is that the only way to win in a revolutionary war is to totally win, right? If you are the power in charge and you are facing a rebel force, the only way to win is to completely win, to put down any thought of a rebellion in the future, to make it so that there's no possibility in the future that anybody will want to be rebellious again. So their only option is total victory. On the American side, the Americans are disorganized. They're badly organized to begin with. There are 13 different governments trying to work together as one government, 13 different colonial militias trying to work together. And some of those militias are separated because you have Boston in Massachusetts, but you also have, you know, 3 miles up the road, or you have Albany in New York City, which are both in New York, but they have different militias because those militias didn't form by the state. They didn't form by the colony. They formed by the city. So you have all kinds of disorganization. Now they voted to put George Washington in charge of this group of patchwork military, but he has to impose that authority, even though their state governments are telling him, yeah, he's in charge, but if he tells you to do this, don't do this, do that. So he's got a lot of trouble organizing. They have very little money or resources because their entire business model is based on serving the crown of England. So they don't have their own economies. They have set up some business and some industry, but they don't have trade with France. They don't have trade with other countries because of all of these laws that stamp down on that. So they don't have a lot of money moving around inside the colonies. Everything that's money has been sent over to England, and everything that's not is tradable goods. They don't have a lot of resources. And they were being supplied by the British until they were in rebellion. So there was a lot of things that they didn't make for themselves that they got from Britain. For example, cloth, glass, things like that, that they could make themselves, but they are not set up to do it yet because that wasn't their job. These are cash crop colonies. They were supposed to be growing tobacco. Britain was supposed to send them everything else. You remember how that was set up, right? So after the British declare them officially in rebellion, they stop sending them supplies. They begin to diminish their supplies. Now that sounds crazy, like, come on guys, get over it. But I was in Walmart last week. We are dependent on our suppliers. We desperately need for our suppliers to keep running. So like if a little snowstorm can make it so that all the shelves in Walmart get cleared out, then the idea of a war cutting you off, yeah, it's not that easy to turn around and immediately start growing your own crops, okay? So let's not judge them too harshly for that. On the other hand, America has its own strengths. They have a strong sense of cause, right? For the British, holding on to the colonies is their cause. But for the Americans, they have been given this propaganda, especially by Thomas Paine, which I hope you guys took a look at that Common Sense and looked at some of what he had to say, that they deserved their independence. They deserved to be able to govern themselves. They deserved freedom from the British parent oppressor. And they don't have to beat Britain. They don't have to defeat Britain. They just have to outlast them. They just have to make sure that they last long enough for Britain to give up on them. So how they fight is different from the way British forces have to fight. British has to win completely and put down any hope of a rebellion in the future. America just has to keep rebelling until Britain gives up. There's no real urban center to defend. Now there are urban centers. There's Boston, there's New York, there's Philadelphia, there's Richmond, there's Charleston. There are places where trading ports that are very active, but at the beginning of the Revolutionary War, they're already 75% British anyway. They're already 75% held by the British soldiers anyway, because they moved troops in as soon as there was the first hint of rebellion against the Tea Act. So the Americans don't consider those their cities anyway. And without those cities, they don't have any cities they have to defend. So if a battle goes badly in an urban center, they just leave. They can move someplace else and have a battle someplace else. So that makes them very hard to chase, okay? America's got some other strengths. They've got Ben Franklin. They've got diplomats who are trained in the Enlightenment, who have been affecting conversations in Europe for 10 years already. They've got incredibly popular. Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, these people are incredibly popular in Europe, but they belong to America and they are fighting on the American side. They're fighting for the American cause. And they've got war-trained generals like Washington and Benedict Arnold. These are generals who trained in the French and Indian War, which means that they know how to fight on American territory. They know how to fight on American terrain. They know how to coordinate between militia and Native American and regulars all together in order to put together a force that deals with America the way the frontier actually is, whereas the British don't. They are fight on field, marching redcoat soldiers. That's what they do. Washington is also, he's, as I said, I think last time we talked about Washington, he's very smart in some ways, but one of them is not war strategy, is not his strong point. War strategy is not his big point, but figuring out which ones of his generals are smart and giving them responsibility, he's actually very good at that. So he is somebody that generals want to work for, smart men want to work for. And Benedict Arnold is an incredibly smart general. And we'll talk a little bit about him. He was a hero of the French and Indian War, and he has chosen to fight on the side of the Americans. So he is an incredibly valuable resource for Washington to have. So it's not a good lineup for America to win to begin with, because really, honestly, Britain could just roll right over. They could take their hands off of everything else they're involved in, roll right over the colonies, put down all rebellions, hang all the traitors, just bulldoze their way through this battle. So it doesn't look good for America. But even then, there's a chance that America might not give up, that America might keep that seed of rebellion. This is what they're finding out in Ireland. What Britain is finding out in Ireland is, even with the island next door to them, right across a small piece of water from them, forcing them to acknowledge that they belong to Britain is not easy. It's hard work. You have to keep a troop presence there all the time. And that troop presence has to put down any hint of rebellion all the time. It's like trying to deal with a roach infestation. You can't let one go by, you know? They have no choice but to try to have total victory. So here is the timeline of the war. Okay, complicated, I recognize. I don't want you to study this too deeply because it's a slide in a PowerPoint. This is actually a PDF that's going to be on Blackboard, so you can look at that separately. But you can see that it starts with the British attacking the garrison at Lexington and Concord, which we talked about actually before the Declaration of Independence, in 1775. And despite these numbers and these statistics, after several different kinds of encounters, in 1782, the British are forced to make peace with America and give them control over their own states. So we're going to break this down into three basic theaters. The first one is in the north. The American forces recognize that the smartest thing they can do is cut off British access to the Ohio River Valley. And so they attack Quebec. And a lot of the early fighting takes place up in the north because it's driven by American forces that are trying to take a strategic advantage. They're trying to take Quebec. If they can take Quebec, then England won't be able to send forces down the St. Lawrence River into the Ohio River Valley and come around behind the colonies and attack. If they can just take control of Quebec, that ends a whole lot of shipping possibilities for Britain. Okay, so that's the first theater of war, and that's early to, summer of 1775. The second theater of war takes place in New York, around New York Harbor. And this is when England actually sends a general to be in charge of fighting the Revolutionary War. It sends General Howe and General Cornwallis. General Howe, or Admiral Howe, excuse me, comes in and he decides that what he needs to do is take the biggest shipping ports, so New York Harbor, and a lot of the fighting takes place there, and the colonial forces are basically decimated in New York. I mean, they are thrashed. And Britain takes over New York. And then the third theater is in the south, when Cornwallis decides that he's going to attack Charleston Harbor. He believes that he can come into the south, attack Charleston Harbor, and flank the entire colonial force and blockade them and make them so that they can't trade out, that they're anchored in, they're surrounded from the north and the south by British forces, and that they will just give up. Okay? So those are the three theaters of war. So let's take this kind of a step at a time. Before the Declaration of Independence, we've already had fighting. And remember, for a while, and you guys wrote a little bit about this in that assignment last week, for a while, they didn't want independence. They wanted home rule. They wanted to be able to establish their own little miniature governments that then reported to the crown. They wanted their own governance. But the British forces came in and treated them as though they were not English people themselves. They weren't English people. They were rebels. They were others. They were something else completely. So the British regulars come in and try to take weapons away from the militia. Every time this happens in a major war event, it becomes history. It becomes a big deal. It happened in Goliad in Texas. When the government comes in and tries to take your weapons away, suddenly that becomes a big thing. That's what happened at Lexington and Concord. In retribution for that, to make sure that it didn't happen again, Benedict Arnold led a force of men to a garrison in New York and took that garrison in New York and seized the weapons there. The intention was to make it so that the British forces didn't have a monopoly on all of the weapons in the colonies, that the Continental Army had a supply of weapons. The response to that was the Battle of Bunker Hill. But by that time, the Continental Army already had a garrison full of weapons that they then moved. And in retribution for Benedict Arnold seizing that garrison, British troops marched in and burned towns in Maine and Massachusetts and Virginia, just came in and burned major towns. So Benedict Arnold gathered his forces and went up into Lake Champlain into Canada to try to cut off the British forces in Quebec. I don't know if this is going to work or not. Let's see. This is the Battle of Bunker Hill. Let's see. Yeah, okay. So British forces are parked on a hillside, Continental forces are parked on a hillside guarding a garrison. They've already moved all of the weapons out, but they hold on to the hillside as long as they can. The British forces run directly at the hillside and are fired upon and killed off until the colonial forces run out of money or run out of ammunition. Once they run out of ammunition, then they retreat. But during that time, the garrison has moved weapons out of the way of the British. So the Battle of Bunker Hill is like really humiliating for the British, but it's not technically a British loss. Okay, so this is because of the Battle of Bunker Hill. British forces realize that this is a real conflict that they're going to have to actually commit soldiers to. So they send an army of 20,000 men under Cornwallis, 500 ships. So in the middle of fighting France and England and Ireland, England gathers 500 ships to send to America and park in the harbors of America to cut off this rebellion. 20,000 men. At this point, Washington has managed to put together about 18,000 soldiers under the Continental Army, but only about 10,000 of them are in New York. So they are utterly, completely surrounded by British forces. The idea is swarm British forces in, surround the Continental Army, humiliate them, defeat them, and put this thing down in the first wave. That's the idea. As a matter of fact, when the Washington men are surrounded and they flee, the British actually have buglers whose job it is to play hunting music so that while they're chasing them, they feel like they're being hunted. And it's supposed to be comical. So that for anybody that's watching, this is supposed to be really humiliating. They end up riding out of New York, out of Long Island, and retreating and retreating and retreating. And at this point, Washington realizes that the only way that he's going to win this, this is a piece of artwork about Washington retreating. They're firing backwards at the British as they cross the river and get the hell out of the way of the British forces and basically let them have the urban center. They let them have New York City. You know, at this point, Washington realizes that what he's fighting and what he's going to have to fight is called a war of attrition. Have y'all ever heard of that? Do you know what a war of attrition is? Yeah.
It's kind of like what Vietnam was, just sending resources, and there's so many resources that's no longer worth it to fight the war.
Right. And how do you win a war of attrition?
By outlasting your enemies.
That's exactly right. It's all about the amount of damage you deal and which one of you is willing to say, I've had enough first. So the idea of a war of attrition is that if you are the attacker, you have to put the rebellion down 100% completely. But if you are the rebel, all you have to do is hit and run. You have to hit and run so long, so often, so unpredictably, that at some point the attackers say, this is not worth it anymore. This is not worth it. We've been sending forces in, and you're right, probably the most stark example of a war of attrition is Vietnam, because literally the Viet Cong were willing to die in mass numbers if it meant that they didn't give up. So, you know, American soldiers and Vietnamese, South Vietnamese soldiers who fought, their whole job was to stop the rebels from wanting to rebel. And the rebels were willing to die in great numbers as long as they didn't have to stop rebelling. So eventually we had to pull out and say, this is no longer worth it. The cost is just too high. And at that point, the North Vietnamese had lost many, many more than America lost, but they still won because they outlasted American attacks. That's what a war of attrition is. Britain attacks and the Continental forces like literally flee the battlefield. They fight and they flee and they survive, and then they attack again, and they fight and they flee and they survive and they attack again. And the British forces never take a point where they can say, there, we won this battle, you guys have to give up. Because at every battle that they won, Washington's men would leave and regroup and attack someplace else. And at some point, Britain has to decide, is it worth it to hold on to these colonies if I'm going to literally have to send soldiers for the rest of time who are going to be attacked and who are going to have to fight? There's no point. At a certain point, they have to give up. Now, even so, America got really, really close to having the rebellion actually put out, because at its core, the Revolutionary War is a civil war. There are Americans who don't want to fight. There are Americans who believe that they should stay loyal to the crown. As a matter of fact, the country is split about 50-50 between people who want to stay loyal to the crown and people who want to have independence from the crown. And they're fighting against each other. Some of the recruits for the Redcoats are coming from inside the colonies. People who want to be loyal to the crown, who don't believe that you should rebel against the crown. So it's a civil war to begin with, and it's also a war of attrition. The only way that Washington is going to win is by keeping his men in the field and fighting until the British give up. And even he's having trouble with that because even Congress has mixed feelings about whether or not they should even be fighting this war. There's kind of a turning point in the Battle of Trenton. And one of the problems that Washington is having is they haven't had a major victory. They've never won on the battlefield in any of the battlefields. They didn't win at Bunker Hill. They just humiliated the British for a while at Bunker Hill. They ran from the field at the Battle of Long Island. They've had 6 other battles since then, and at all of those battles they've lost. So they haven't had a victory at all. They're running out of resources. They're running out of weapons. And then this thing happens. It's over Christmas in 1776. So remember, the Declaration of Independence is July of 1776. So this is just 6 months later. And they happen upon an encampment of Hessian mercenaries. Now, a Hessian is a German soldier. The English have, because the crown is related across to Germany, they have a lot of like relatives across the water in Germany. So there's a lot of back and forth between Germany and England. They're good friends, mostly. And especially in Hesse, they hire Hessian mercenaries to come to the American colonies and fight. Hessian that's hard to say. Hessian mercenaries. And Washington makes a decision, even though the river is frozen solid and is great big ice chunks in the river, even though the river is really, really cold, he decides to take his men and cross the river and attack this encampment, because he knows that this encampment has a lot of weapons and storage and food and lots of supplies. And if they can take the encampment, then they will have all those resources. But he decides to attack on Christmas Eve. And on Christmas Eve, the entire encampment is drunk off their butts. These are German beer drinking partiers. These people, it's Christmas. They were ready for, a party. And they are absolutely drunk and passed out all over the camp. They don't think of Washington's forces as particularly a threat. So he manages to move his men around in a direction they're not expecting. They're encamped on a frozen river. Nobody's going to sail boats across a frozen river in a canyon, especially not on Christmas Eve, except that that's exactly what Washington did. So he arrives in the camp, and everybody in the camp is wasted. And when they wake up and find themselves at the gunpoint of Continental soldiers, a large majority of the Hessians are like, yeah, that's cool. You want us to join you? We could be on your side too. We don't care. We just want to fight. We don't really care which side we're on. They have no particular loyalty to the King of England. So they kill 22 and 83 are wounded. None of them are Americans. Of the wounded and killed, none of them were American soldiers. And they capture 896 of the 1,000 mercenaries there. They capture them. But they don't hold them prisoner, obviously, because who has the time for that? But they get 1,000 new weapons, a full encampment of food and supplies, and they get a location from which they can, launch further attacks. So word gets back immediately that Washington has had this tremendous victory, that he attacked an encampment of 1,000 men, didn't lose a single person, and took all of them prisoner and took all of their supplies and everything. That propaganda makes it back to Congress. But what really happened is they were all drunk. So if you're interested, there's a drunk history episode about that. It's pretty funny. So from there, no, I don't want to say from there. On another plane in another place, from the victory at Trenton, Washington begins to engage in a series of hit and run battles. This worked. He decides that this worked. So for about a year, that's all we have, are a bunch of little hit and run battles. Britain almost always wins, but they never defeat American forces enough so that American forces have to, quit and surrender. They just flee. They fight and they flee, and they fight and they flee. And every time they do, the British lose men. The British lose soldiers. So they're kind of like, bleeding out a little bit. British General Howe is supposed to meet with his partner, British General Burgoyne, who is supposed to take Philadelphia. So you remember, Britain is still focused on taking all these cities. They want to make sure that they have control of the cities. So a British general is responsible for taking Philadelphia. And he does. Burgoyne goes, he marches his troops into Philadelphia. He takes Philadelphia without really much of a fight because the colonial militia is not there. The Continental Army is not there. He settles in, he finds a mansion he likes. He settles in and starts to have parties, and he gets comfortable. Now he's supposed to march up the river and bring his forces to meet in Quebec. I have that backwards. Yeah, I'm looking at my PowerPoint now, and it's Burgoyne who's marching. It's General Howe who's gotten comfortable. Yeah, sorry about that. Y'all are looking at it too, so you can see. He is supposed to come down from Quebec and march his forces, and the Philadelphia guy is supposed to come up from Philadelphia and meet him, but he got comfortable and kind of didn't show up. So as a result, when Burgoyne marched down into Saratoga, the Continental Army was waiting for him there, and he was cut off from the person that was supposed to provide him with support. So he had no choice but to surrender to the Continentals. He actually had to surrender, General Burgoyne actually had to surrender a battlefield to the Continentals. This is in Saratoga. So this is the first time the Continental forces actually win on the battlefield in such a way that it makes news all the way over in Europe. General Burgoyne defeated, and General Howe gets in a lot of trouble for this, but not enough trouble that he has to quit being, that he has to quit being the general. So now that we've had a couple of victories, but we're still in the middle of this hit and run, it's important that we establish a winter camp. Because really, at this time, it's not really common for soldiers to fight during the winter. That's not the case now. I mean, World War II, the Battle of the Bulge, the Ardennes Forest, we were allowed ourselves to fight in 6-foot drifts of snow and all that kind of stuff. But it really wasn't standard practice for fights. You took the winter off. Everybody took the winter off, and you encamped for the winter. So they had to pick a campsite that made sense to them. They picked a place called Valley Forge, which was really close to Philadelphia. It was chosen because it was a flat plateau that overlooked Philadelphia, so they could come to Philadelphia's rescue if they needed to, since it's the one urban center that they're kind of holding on to now. They've managed to push, because Howe got in trouble for being settled in Philadelphia, he got pushed out and reassigned. So they've managed to take over Philadelphia, the Continental Army. So parked above that, a couple of miles outside of town, they set up their winter encampment. And that goes really, really horribly wrong. How many of y'all have heard of Valley Forge? What do you think of when you hear of Valley Forge? Huh? Starving, cold, snow. Right. The situation at Valley Forge. Oh, this is not that. This is something else. These are images from the Battle of Saratoga. So, yeah. Okay, we're gonna skip past that. The encampment in Valley Forge is 12,000 people, and they're not just 12,000 soldiers, because families came and stayed with their soldier husbands, wives and children, some of them, and slaves that belonged to some of the soldiers came and stayed at Valley Forge with them. So it's 12,000 people, and they are starving. They are extremely short of supplies. They picked the encampment because it's easy to see Philadelphia from there, but the roads between Valley Forge and Philadelphia are really hard to cross in the winter. They get closed down really easily because of the snow. Congress votes to supply them in May and June. Congress votes to supply the winter encampment with food and supplies. But by the time winter comes, it still hasn't happened. Because while they vote all they want to, nobody knows whose job it is to actually make it happen. Nobody knows whose job it is to actually set up the shipments, pick up the supplies, and actually carry them to the military. So Congress can vote all it wants to, but it doesn't have supplies coming in. In December, Washington writes to Congress for help and tells them that he's starving, that his men are starving, that their morale is extremely low, but that they're staying the course. Could Congress please support them? And we do have some things happen. For example, in January, women from Philadelphia see what's going on up in Valley Forge, and they smuggle 10 oxen into camp. They just drive them into camp, and they just push them into camp, and they get slaughtered and killed and eaten by the men, like right away. They also carry 2,000 new shirts into camp, and the townspeople pull together their supplies and just drive them into camp. So Philadelphia is trying to support Valley Forge. In January 24th of that next year, 1778, Congress actually sends a delegation into Valley Forge. So I'm going to finish today by talking about Valley Forge, because I want to talk about the legacy of those shortages. So you've got to remember that while it is illegal for somebody to defect, to leave the army after to go AWOL, that's the thing. What's the word I'm looking for? It's not defect. Abandon. What's the word? Oh, I'll think of it in a few minutes. Anyway, just because somebody it is illegal for people to leave their post and just leave. It's still happening in massive numbers. I mean, it's still happening all over the place, but it's not complete. There is a whole camp of soldiers here who could sneak away in the night and nobody would blame them, but they stay. Desert, that was the word. Thank you, Jordan. That was going to bother me. Okay, so for those soldiers who remain, they have some legacies that they take out of this. First of all, they do manage to get a trainer into the camp. Friedrich von Steuben, who is Prussian, comes into the camp and begins training the men so that they can finally have the training they should have had before they started the war. They actually get the same training that the British regulars get. They get trained in how to do, line up and shoot fighting, but also bayonet fighting and hand-to-hand combat and knife fighting and artillery fighting. They finally get trainers in to do that. It's the first time that we see battlefield nurses that are women. There was a time in the Middle Ages when women did nurse men, but there's been this wave of separation since then, where it's considered inappropriate for a woman to see a man without most of his clothes on. And I don't know if you've ever done any nursing, but you can't be a nurse to a wounded man and not see his legs. But we've had this whole movement all through the 1600s and 1700s where it's inappropriate for a woman to see a man's legs. So or his bare arms. So actually treating him for his wounds was something women weren't supposed to do. That breaks down at Valley Forge. Women go, look, we can't keep doing that. We've got to help, and you've just got to get over the fact that it's us doing it. So women actually become battlefield nurses during Valley Forge. There's a lot of resentment that happens because the men are starving, but somehow officers still get fed. The local townspeople are really careful when they do bring in supplies to make sure the officers get to eat. Officers can leave and actually go dine in Philadelphia and then come back. They can go to house parties, and the enlisted men can't. The regulars can't. So there's a lot of resentment between those two groups, and that's going to grow, and we're going to see that after the war. People who served as officers are going to find out that the men that they served with, that were enlisted, don't like them very much and don't really think it's a good idea for them to have, I don't know, say large plantations and things like that. So that resentment is going to grow between those two groups. But probably the biggest legacy, oh, there's also widespread disease. One of the things that happens is that there are 2 outbreaks of smallpox. And with the first outbreak of smallpox, Washington orders his men all to be inoculated. I don't know if you remember us talking about this, but the inoculation for smallpox is a smaller infection of smallpox. It's a weaker infection of smallpox, but that's been produced. Like, they've actually got places that are producing these weaker smallpox vaccinations. So they basically take somebody with a weak case of smallpox and they take their blood and they inject it into the blood of healthy people so that they'll catch a small person. So they lose about 15% of their people to smallpox after the inoculation. But the other 85% doesn't get wiped out by the smallpox when it comes back through again. So it's the first time of basically a government-imposed smallpox vaccination. But probably the biggest legacy is a commitment to the cause. Washington says in his letters back to Congress, to see men without clothes to cover their nakedness, without blankets to lay on, without shoes by which their marches may be traced by the blood from their feet, and almost as often without provisions as with, marching through frost and snow, and at Christmas taking up their winter quarters within a day's march of the enemy, without a house or a hut to cover them till they can be built, and submitting to it without a murmur is a mark of patience and obedience which cannot, in my opinion, can scarce be paralleled. The fact that these men could have deserted and didn't, that they were so devoted to the cause that they were willing to winter out Valley Forge, is a legacy that we keep. This is actually a World War II propaganda poster. It's a poster from World War II that reminds the American soldiers who are living in the Ardennes forest, who are surrounded by German soldiers and cut off from all of their supplies, that they're not the first Americans to have been in that position, and that they should take inspiration from Valley Forge in order to tough out the winter that they're having in Germany. So the pride of a soldier who made it through Valley Forge to end up back on the battlefield afterwards is something that they carry forward with them as the country is established. That we survived Valley Forge, that's something that they carry with them. So that's where I'm going to stop us today. But at this point, we have the bulk of the Continental Army wintering in a place where the Congress is not taking care of them, where they're running out of everything, where their scarcity is killing them off, disease is killing them off, but they are still holding on to the cause with all their might. And the British forces are going to send Cornwallis, who is a gifted general, to take them out. So that's where we'll start on Friday. Any questions? Okay, you don't have an assignment for this today? I think during exam weeks, I don't give you assignments. I'm pretty sure that's true. Yeah, so you're not going to have assignments on this, but yeah, just prepare for your exam. And some of this will be on the exam, so that'll help. Right, so I'll see you on Friday. On Friday, we'll cover the rest of the Revolutionary War, and if we have time, we'll do a little review for the exam. All right. Y'all doing okay? Any questions from Zoom?